You can imagine Ethereum as like the United States as a country, right? Ethereum is it's not a country, but like it's a network, and it is akin to the United States. But then within the United States, you have a bunch of different states, right? That's why it's called the United States. But all these states, they basically exist under the kind of federal umbrella that is the United States, but they have their own kind of laws. You know, each state has its own way of doing things, its own laws. And then within that, you have like different businesses that have to follow those laws and so on and so forth. But all of those states have to follow the federal laws as well. So you have the federal laws and the state laws. So the analogy to Ethereum is that Ethereum L1 or layer 1 is the United States, right? But then you have Ethereum L2s or layer 2, which are the states. So these L2s have to follow the rules of the Ethereum L1 or layer 1 protocol because they're using the Ethereum layer 1 protocol to secure themselves.
All right. Well, just to start off, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on. My name, for those that don't know, is Anthony Sassano. I go by sassel.eth on Twitter. I've been in the crypto ecosystem for quite a long time now with a primary focus on Ethereum. So I run a daily kind of Ethereum educational show on YouTube. It's a podcast as well, just keeping everyone up to date on what's happening within the Ethereum ecosystem. And I also do a bunch of angel investing and advising different companies within the ecosystem.
All right. Well, to get us going, can you give us a really simple explanation, like so simple my mom would understand this explanation of what is Ethereum?
Yeah, so it's always quite difficult to give these simple explanations, right? Because I think that if you're trying to explain it to someone who's not in the ecosystem at all, I think the best place to start is really to explain the applications themselves. Like not actually talk about Ethereum, but talk about the applications that Ethereum enables. So for example, if you were to say, hey, you know your bank account that you have, and when you send money like overseas, for example, you know how long that takes? It takes like a week sometimes, and there's all these fees, and you can't track where the money's going. Here's this crypto thing. I can send money instantly across the globe, or near instantly. I mean, it depends, which if you're using an Ethereum L1 or the L2s, but you're not going to say that to them, right? You're just going to try and keep it as simple as possible and say, hey, I can send this, and here's the receipt, and I can actually track it the whole way, and I can see that they actually received the funds here. And that's really it. I think that actually resonates with most people because they're used to that flow already, right? Of sending money, not even just sending it overseas, but sending it to just their friends and family that are local to them. You know, everyone's got like Venmo on their phone and stuff like that, right? So they're used to that concept already in like the TradFi world. But as soon as you tell them, hey, we're doing that, but like 100 times better than what you're used to, then from there, they start to get curious, and you can start kind of talking about other things that they can kind of do on there, which I think is really cool. And then I think NFTs are a good way to explain it as well. Like if you say to, especially like maybe not my mom, but like the younger kind of crowd that's not in crypto, say, hey, you can buy like those skins in your Counter-Strike Go games. Well, you can buy like these NFT things and you can actually own them. Like it's not Valve that owns them, it's actually you, and you can trade them. And they kind of get that straight away because they're already doing that within the kind of Steam marketplace. So yeah, there are different kind of strokes for different folks, but I think once you connect it to something that they're already used to or that they're already kind of familiar with, it resonates a lot quicker. And I didn't mention Ethereum in any of that.
Yeah. So you're explaining the things that you can use Ethereum for. So you can use it for these financial use cases. You can use it for digital ownership use cases for like game items or NFTs, PFPs, different things like that. There's a lot of people have tried to kind of summarize what Ethereum is in the past. It used to be like the internet computer was, or no, maybe that's ICP.
Is it like the world computer?
The world
and
computer,
then, I mean, there was, world computer, and there was a bunch of different things. Yeah, I mean, it's evolved over time, but I think because Ethereum is so generalized, it's kind of hard to actually put one narrative on it.
It is super generalized, but it's sort of like maybe a way to explain it is like a sort of like a different version of the internet. Is that a fair way to say it? Is like, because you might get online or you might get on chain, and so it's like this different version of the internet. Is that a good way to describe it?
I think so. I think, recently the term on-chain has taken off. Like, it's kind of funny how long it took for that term to actually stick and take off, because usually we would refer to these things as, as we mentioned, world computer or like the internet computer or decentralized kind of apps or blockchains. We would use all these just abstract terms that no one is really familiar with. But then I think Jesse Pollack, who is the lead at the base effort at Coinbase, he actually kind of popularized the term on-chain. He's like, well, people already know what online is, so if we just use the term on-chain, that will immediately resonate with them, just as I was describing before about using familiar terms for people. So I think that the fact that it took us ages to get here just means we're really bad at naming things as an ecosystem. But yeah, I totally think that. I think, it's probably I don't know if it's the best way to describe it, but it's like a financial version of the internet, essentially, right? Because obviously most of the stuff that happens on blockchains is inherently financial in nature. I think that's probably a good way to describe it for people. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier about, using familiar things to get kind of the point across to people.
Okay, so I always think of Ethereum as almost 4 different layers, going back to Ethereum as a whole. So, and we're going to go through each different layer, and you can correct me if you're like, that doesn't ring true with me. So at the core, I would say there's like the core security of Ethereum, and this is used for things like eigenlayer and restaking. This is like the core of Ethereum. Then you have the layer 1 Ethereum blockchain. So this is used for, this is like the highest level of security. This is one people complain about. The fees are really expensive. This is the original Ethereum blockchain. That's the layer 1 Ethereum blockchain. Then you have the layer 2 blockchains built on top of Ethereum. So this is things like Base, Arbitrum, Optimism, etc. There's a ton of them, but those are maybe the most well-known ones. And then finally, the 4th layer would be ETH as a monetary asset. So this is a monetary asset. It might not even be on Ethereum. You can have this maybe it's used on Avalanche, it's used on Solana, it's used all over the place. You have ETH as the monetary asset. So we're going to go through all 4 of these. We're going to start with the layer 1 Ethereum blockchain. Can you maybe give an overview of what that is?
Yeah, so I think of the layer 1 Ethereum chain in a few different ways. Maybe the thing that resonates most with people is it's a property rights management system, essentially. So you can imagine in the US, for example, or in a nation state, but I think the US is probably the strongest example here. You have really strong property rights, right? Like you have a really strong legal system built up around the fact that if you own that house, it is your house. Someone can't just come along and take your house and now they own your house, right? They have to buy it from you, or it has to be passed down to them, as part of like a will or something. But that is, a very strong property right there. And that extends to basically every form of ownership that you can have over anything within your life, within the US and other places around the world, of course. I mean, Western nations are probably the best embodiment of that. So the same is true for Ethereum. It is a property rights management system where essentially, as I was explaining before, if you hold ETH in your own wallet, no one can come and take that from you. They can buy it from you. You can sell it to them. You can send it to them for free. You can tip people with them. You can buy physical goods or something from someone with ETH, but no one can come and take that from you, for no reason. I mean, they can try and take it from you with force, just like someone can steal something from you in real life, but there are consequences for that.
And this is going to sound really stupid to you, but I think for the average person, they don't understand this. Who controls Ethereum? Is it Vitalik? Is this like Vitalik's network where he is like, hey, this is he's like Mark Zuckerberg and this is his Facebook. Who's in charge? Like who makes the upgrades and who says, hey, we're going to advance Ethereum forward and do this upgrade or that upgrade?
Yeah, so I would say that there's no one in charge of Ethereum, the network. There are plenty of people that work on the Ethereum protocol. We call them core developers and researchers. So there are about 160, 170 of those folks that are publicly kind of like named and work more or less kind of full time within that sphere there. And those are the ones that, they do the research on any new upgrades that could potentially make it into the Ethereum network. And then they also develop the code for the clients that people run on their own machines for the network. But they do not control what goes into the network. They can just propose things. The community can discuss it. If people like it, it will go in. If people don't like it, it won't go in. That's what we mean by it's decentralized. There's no central kind of like, CEO or some executive that can just order the network to change because of how they feel. Like no one can do that. Not even Vitalik would be able to do that as Ethereum exists today. So essentially, it's more like it's not exactly akin to this, but it's more like a democratic kind of government that's elected by the people, right? If enough people want to elect this party, that party will get elected, or this president, for example, that will get elected. Whereas within Ethereum, if enough people want something to go into the network, it will go into the network, and if not, it won't, sort of thing. But it's not like a 50% thing. It's not like, oh, you only need 50% or 51% of the votes to win the presidency. It's a super majority. So I would say it's like over 90% at least least, of, the community of the network would need to accept this change for it to go in. It can't just be 50%. That wouldn't make it. So the bar is very, very high to get changes in. So that's where the analogy may break down a little bit.
I've heard, like with Vitalik, he's had almost the most denied Ethereum proposals. So like he'll submit a ton of proposals and they'll get denied because he isn't in charge. And even when it comes to the Ethereum Foundation, which is a nonprofit that works on Ethereum, if they submit something that the community doesn't like, that also doesn't go through. They recently submitted something. They're like, hey, we think we want to change the issuance curve. And people didn't like that. They said, hey, we don't want to do that. And so now it's having to go through discussions and a process because they can't just go do that because they aren't in charge of the network. It's kind of like everyone's in charge of the network. Everyone that's involved has kind of a voice in the network. And you have all these validators. You have millions and millions of dollars of validators that secure the network when it comes to like their staked ETH and the hardware, et cetera. And who do these people work for? Do they work for the Ethereum Foundation? They work for Vitalik? No, they work essentially for Ethereum. They work for this big network, this code. It's just like the Bitcoin miners. Bitcoin miners, there is no one they work for. They work for the network. These developers work for the network. The network has such good incentives that it attracts all this talent, all this mind share, all this hardware and hard work to the network just based off those incentives. And for Bitcoin, that's it gives miners rewards. And for Ethereum, it's the same thing. Ethereum has their own set of rewards that they give to validators and et cetera. Moving on. So, okay, Ethereum Layer 1 is this property rights system, as you called it. And I think that's a really, really good way to describe it. It's a place where you can have digital property rights. And that could be used for games, that could be used for art, that could be used for money, that could be used for all kinds of financial things. These property rights are so good. The BlackRock, they've just recently deployed, it's like $100 million or a couple $100 million fund on Ethereum. They trust Ethereum, and Wall Street, they're like super, super OCD about these kind of things. They trust Ethereum with hundreds of millions of dollars because the property rights are that strong and that good on the L1 blockchain. But can you describe what's an L2? What's an Ethereum L2? I think L2s are widely misunderstood. So can you go into what Ethereum L2s are and how do they relate to Ethereum, the Layer 1?
Yeah. So I think probably the best way to describe it is maybe another analogy that people may be familiar with. So you can imagine Ethereum as like the United States as a country, right? Ethereum is it's not a country, but like it's a network and it is akin to the United States. But then within the United States, you have a bunch of different states, right? That's why it's called the United States. But all these states, they basically exist under the kind of federal umbrella that is the United States, but they have their own kind of laws. Each state has its own way of doing things, its own laws. And then within that, you have like different businesses that have to follow those laws and so on and so forth. But all of those states have to follow the federal laws as well. So you have the federal laws and the state laws. So the analogy to Ethereum is that Ethereum L1 or Layer 1 is the United States, right? But then you have Ethereum L2s or Layer 2, which are the states. So these L2s have to follow the rules of the Ethereum L1 or Layer 1 protocol because they're using the Ethereum Layer 1 protocol to secure themselves. So they're essentially different chains. So you kind of, you bridge to this chain. So you'll kind of move your money from Ethereum Layer 1 to the Layer 2, but you're still secured by Ethereum Layer 1. You're still under that umbrella. Like the United States Army still secures all of the states. Ethereum's L1 security still secures you on a Layer 2 because you're basically part of that network still, but you're basically part of a different kind of portion of that network essentially. And you're doing something different there. And the benefits of that obviously, or maybe not obviously, but people may not be familiar with it, but the reason why we do this is because there's cheaper fees at these higher layers, at Layer 2 basically. So instead of spending maybe like $5-10 for a swap on Ethereum Layer 1, like a Uniswap trade, you would spend like 1 cent or 2 cents on these Layer 2s. And that's the main motivation for people to move across, is that it's much cheaper and it's also faster as well. But still, the whole idea is that these Layer 2s are still part of the Ethereum Layer 1 and they're still secured by it. And that way we get the best of all worlds. We get a super, super secure, albeit expensive Layer 1. It has to be expensive for it to be secure, I think, in the way Ethereum's architected, because if it gets too cheap, that means what we've done is we've basically increase the hardware requirements to run the network, which means that it becomes more centralized. So we basically lose those guarantees around decentralization and property rights and things like that. So by keeping the network, rather constrained, we allow anyone in the world to run it on consumer hardware. That's the whole point at layer 1. And then layer 2s, we basically scale for the end users. And there's a lot of technical stuff that goes into this, but essentially the goal of the layer 2s is to basically be like Ethereum layer 1 in terms of security guarantees and user flow and stuff like that, while offering these cheaper fees as well.
That's a really, really good analogy. So the federal government is Ethereum. The states are the L2s. And I think a lot of people maybe don't remember what states are for in the US, but states were supposed to be, they're almost like their own little they're not really countries, but they're almost like their own little sovereign countries. So like they get to set a ton of different rules for themselves, their own like tax laws. And they were supposed to have a lot of like maneuverability within themselves. And they're just like all connected together and united under the federal government. I think we've gotten to a place where like the federal government dictates a lot more than maybe the founding fathers intended about the states. But that gives you kind of an idea, a really, really good idea of what L2s are. And the L2s are like a form of experimentation. So like think about I like to think about the Apple App Store. I think that's a really good way of like back in the day, cell phones came with all the apps that you're allowed to have on them. So like if you bought a cell phone, it came with the built-in apps. There was no ability to get other apps outside of that. So you might have like a couple games, maybe it's like Pong's on there. You got like a camera, you got like a, some sort of, I don't know. I don't even remember what the apps were. They were
MP3 players and stuff like that, right? Yeah. A radio app.
Yeah, a radio app. And that was all you're allowed. And then Apple came up with this crazy idea, which today maybe doesn't seem crazy, but back in the day it was revolutionary, of like, what if we had a store for other people to come in and build their own apps to be used on the iPhone? And that like opened up this world of innovation, because there's no way Apple is like had the ability to like make all these cool apps. Like they did. There's so many apps that like it's just a lot of work for them, and they don't know what's going to work or what's not going to work. They have to really be really specific about what kind of apps they want on their phones. So instead, they left it up to the open market. Anyone could come build an app, and it could be a really stupid app. And there were a lot of stupid apps. And then there was also stupid apps that were actually kind of cool that people liked, but that Apple would have never built. And so it's just all this innovation kind of came from this Apple App Store. And all these apps got built that never before existed. And I think L2 is kind of like that, where, there's a lot of things that Ethereum can't do. If it wants to maintain the highest level of property rights and security, there's just experiments it cannot make. But L2s, they can experiment away. They could do all kinds of crazy things. They could do stupid stuff. They could do wild stuff. And that's kind of the point, is like, we'll see what sticks. We'll see what doesn't stick. But they have the ability to do all this experimentation. And Ethereum stays this really high property rights place. But they're all connected and secured together. So, but what I want to ask is like, cool, all this experimentation, but why don't these L2s just launch as an L1? What does launching as an L2 offer over just launching as another blockchain?
Yeah. So I'll try to keep this as non-technical as possible, because there are some really, really great technical properties you get by being a layer 2 instead of a layer 1. But following on your point of kind of experimentation here, so that could exist as a layer 1. I mean, we've seen plenty of other layer 1s spin up over the years, and they've experimented with different ways of doing things. They may be having their own virtual machines, and they're not using Ethereum's virtual machine, they're using their own. They may be experimenting with different governance mechanisms. They may be experimenting with different types of proof of stake, very different to Ethereum's proof of stake. So we've already seen this play out over the last, so and so many years. And most of these layer 1s have completely failed to gain any traction. There are a couple out there that have gained some traction, but most of them have failed to gain any sorts of traction. And I don't think that's got to do with the fact that they weren't kind of desirable and that they experimented and they didn't find product market fit based on those experiments. I think that just the nature of being a layer 1 isolates them from the biggest pools of users and liquidity, which exists on Ethereum. So the concept of these layer 2s and what makes them so kind of valuable is that they get to tap into that immediately by being in Ethereum's orbit, by being kind of like these chains that are directly connected to Ethereum via, still bridges, but directly connected and more secure bridges. And by tapping into the Ethereum ecosystem, they get to automatically get a network effect from that. They basically get to get everyone coming and bridging their ETH across, bridging their tokens across, getting the users coming across. The infrastructure is already there. You don't have to download a new wallet, for example. You can use your existing wallet. You just have to change your network. But there's even wallets now where you don't even have to do that anymore. It just does it for you automatically because it's abstracted it away. Yeah. I think that's a big thing for people, is that the infrastructure is there and it maps kind of very nicely from Ethereum L1 to L2. Whereas a lot of these other L1s, or pretty much all of them, except a couple, you had to actually download a different wallet. And that's actually a huge switching cost for people, because if you have to download a different wallet, it means that you now have to secure that wallet, and then you also have to get the chain's native asset. So if you want to go use Solana, for example, you would have to go and get the Sol token into your new wallet, and then you would go on chain, and you have to learn how Solana handles transactions. It's very different to how Ethereum does it, and their network is very different to how Ethereum is. So there was just a massive switching cost to begin with, whereas with layer 2s, there aren't. And then on top of that, because you're so close to the Ethereum ecosystem, you have all of the existing Ethereum apps that already have a lot of users porting to these layer 2s and saying, hey, come use it. So you got the brand awareness. Uniswap on a layer 2, I remember actually a few instances of this where a layer 2 would launch, they'd have a Uniswap kind of competitor launch on their chain where it would be the same concept of Uniswap, but it wouldn't be Uniswap. They'd gain some traction, but then Uniswap would come in and crush them because everyone knows Uniswap, right? They trust Uniswap. The brand awareness is there. And Uniswap would be the main benefactor of that. And it's very similar to how, say you're in like a town and you open a store because a big chain isn't there yet, but then a big chain store comes along and just crushes all the small businesses. Obviously not great for competition, but that's, I guess, like the analogy I think that maps there, in that's why people kind of flock to these layer 2s. And I think that the layer 1 experiments that have been done have been tried out for the most part. I think more and more layer 2s are going to be launching than layer 1s now because you get access to that ecosystem there. But then if we delve a little bit deeper into the technical side of things, just from a pure kind of security perspective, you basically get to, when you construct your layer 2 properly, because there are different ways to construct it, but when you construct it properly, you basically get to immediately tap into the massive security that Ethereum has. So the analogy is, imagine being able to be protected by the US Army, like the US military, right? Instead of your local police department, you are now protected by the entire force of the US Army, which is the equivalent here, in that the layer 2s are now protected and their property rights are now enforced by the layer 1 Ethereum security. And that, to me, is the biggest benefit from the technical side of things, or from the economic side of things, because that means that you no longer have to bootstrap your own security, which is a huge ask and a huge order. Because to bootstrap your own security, not only do you have to attract people to run the software, you have to make sure, or try to encourage it to be decentralized. Because if it's not decentralized, then you don't actually get what makes a blockchain valuable, which is that strong property rights system that we've been discussing, basically. So those are the two main things to me that make them so attractive and so valuable. And they are inherently, or can be inherently, more scalable than the other layer 1s out there, while being cheaper to run and more sustainable to run, which is another point that falls into the economics point.
I think another point, like when you said cheaper to run, that's one thing to emphasize is, most blockchains aren't profitable, in that most blockchains run at a deficit. So they have to print tokens to pay and incentivize validators to secure the network. And this is something a lot of people don't understand, because we haven't really had a lot of attacks on blockchains. I remember early days, 2017, Ethereum Classic was attacked, and there was some. But lately, not in recent memory have I seen an attack where a blockchain as a whole has been hacked in some way, or destroyed in some way. So maybe it's not top of mind for most people, but it is really important, if you want to secure a lot of money, that blockchains be really secure. And I think we've gotten kind of lazy with it, and I do think probably over the next 5 years we're going to see a consequence to that laziness with some of these maybe alternative chains. But when it comes to L2s, they don't have to pay for their own security. The security is the highest cost for a blockchain. And an L2 doesn't have to pay for that, because they're essentially able to get that from the L1, from Ethereum's L1. And so that allows a lot of these L2s to be profitable, as long as they have enough users and transactions, pretty much from the get-go. So you can launch, let's give an example of Avalanche. Avalanche today, as far as I'm aware, isn't profitable. So they have to print more tokens than they actually make in transaction fees.
Or it's deeply unprofitable last time I checked. Yeah.
to actually pay for the network. Ethereum, the L1, though, is profitable. It actually makes more in revenue on the network from fees than it expends to secure the network. And then Ethereum L2s, they don't even have to pay for security. So they get profitable really quick. So somebody can launch an L2 and boom, if it gets traction, you're profitable in a month, in 2 months, or whatever, depending on the amount of traction. So I think that's a huge advantage to an L2, is just think from a cost savings, why would you want to launch an L1 and bootstrap your own security? when you can essentially rent that from Ethereum in a sense, or tap into that with Ethereum by being an L2. And there are reasons, and we'll get into that and maybe some other ways that works with things like EigenLayer. But I think that's a huge one. You mentioned the network effects of just being able to use the same wallets, apps, developers being able to use the same code and kind of port it over for these networks. All that I think makes sense for L2s. One thing I hear as an argument against L2s all the time is that L2s fragment liquidity and users. Do you want to maybe get into that and maybe how that works and where that's going?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe an overblown thing that people kind of talk about. I understand the issues with the concept of fragmented liquidity. And maybe for those who don't know, it's essentially this thing where, say you want to do something on Ethereum L1, but you have funds on an L2. Well, now you have to bridge from that L2 to L1, and that may take some time and cost some money to do so. Now, that is the concept of fragmented liquidity, where the liquidity that you want to access is not on the L2 that you're on, it's on L1. So you have to bridge across. But the problem I have with these kind of statements is that this is not an issue that's exclusive to layer 2s. This is an issue that exists across the entire crypto ecosystem. If I want to do something on Solana and I'm on Ethereum, I have to bridge to Solana, right? Like I can't just stay on Ethereum and use Solana apps and vice versa. So I would say that it is a user experience issue where it is kind of annoying that you have to do this, but it is not exclusive to layer 2s. But the nice thing is that with layer 2s, we can actually rectify this a lot easier than we can with layer 1s, because layer 2s all settle down to the same layer 1, all settle down to Ethereum. So they basically are able to interoperate within each other because they're all settling down to the same Ethereum L1 without worrying about certain very technical things. We call them reorgs, which is the big one, where essentially if a reorg was to happen on one of the chains that you're interoperating with, if you're trying to interoperate between different L1s, it could have a cascading effect where it could reverse your transactions and be really, really bad, and it could cause accounting errors and things like that. Whereas with L2s, because they all settle down to the same L1, you don't necessarily have that risk because you're only using one L1, you're only using Ethereum. So it's basically that shared settlement layer there. And as I said, it is getting a little bit technical in that. But yeah, that's how I generally kind of think about the liquidity fragmentation. But as I said, it is a issue from a user experience perspective. It's not unique to the L2s, but it is getting rectified as time goes on, and it's going to become easier and easier for people to move between networks. But also maybe eventually, and I actually believe this pretty strongly, I don't think it's a maybe, I think it's a certainty, most people aren't going to be moving between layers, right? There's going to be enough liquidity and enough stuff to do on on a layer that most people are just going to sit on one thing. So maybe they'll just sit on Base, or they'll sit on Arbitrum, for example, or they'll sit in Ethereum L1 because they're big players and they don't care about paying the higher fees, and they won't necessarily move too often. And I think that that's going to be the case for the vast majority of people, because the vast majority of people are not going to be very fancy about what they do on chain. Just like in real life, the vast majority of people don't do fancy things with their financial lives. They may have some investments over here. Then, they have like one bank account. They have some investments in stocks. They maybe have some property, some real estate, stuff like that. But they're not doing all these completely complex, hugely complex financial transactions that a lot of the, I guess, degens, as we call them, on chain do today. So I think that, yeah, eventually it's going to become very kind of balkanized like that, where essentially you have different, moats of chains, and you can bridge between them, and that'll be abstracted away. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really see it as a showstopper. And I think from the growth of L2s and how much traction they've gotten, I don't think users see it as a showstopper either.
and maybe to make this really simple for the average person to break it down, the kind of argument goes between two different things. So like when people say fragmented liquidity, I think they're thinking of the opposite being, hey, everything just being on one chain. So like in their mind, it'd be better if everything was on one chain. But I think few people understand that that's kind of like thinking that the internet in the early days would all be on one site. So, and that actually was a vision. So like AOL, their early vision, from my understanding, was that they thought the whole internet could be on AOL. So like you could come check your weather, you could message, you could email your friends, you could see what sports stats were out, all on AOL. You don't need to go anywhere else. And you got to imagine back in the day, it was like 30 minutes to boot up, your modem. You get on the website and it's like, 5 minutes to load this image that's on the website. It's usually mostly text. So it's like, man, it's a lot to move between websites. It was like pretty difficult. right? And so they're like, we're just gonna have an all-on website. That makes it a lot easier for the average person. And it was really hard to navigate the internet back then. We didn't have like Google search and different things like that. It was just really confusing for most people. And the idea for Ethereum is like, no, like we don't actually think that everything's going to be on one. Think of it as a server, as one server. We think that like we can't scale up one server to have that much like traffic and that much activity going on. We think it'll break, it won't work. But other blockchains like Solana specifically thinks that they can do that, and it's actually a pretty advantageous goal. And I respect them for thinking like, hey, we want to try to build this crazy server that can host everyone on the entire planet. That's like kind of their goal. And Ethereum's like, nah, we kind of think this is going to turn out like the internet, where we're going to have like lots of different networks all connected together to create this like super network. And like all these different websites are going to be different. And they're going to have different purposes. And instead of having like one generalized website, we're going to have a lot of specialized website. And this one does this one's a privacy one, this one's this. That's kind of the vision for Ethereum. And we do have some cool solutions coming, like you kind of hinted at, which is like we have things like the ag layer, Polygon's ag layer. That's a great thing. We have shared sequencing. We have things like not like 10 years down the line, not 5 years down the line, but like realistically, we could see some of these solutions this year where these networks connect together. And I think most people would agree that if we can connect the networks together and it's seamless to move between these blockchains as it is a website, then yeah, it kind of does make a lot of sense to have a bunch of L2s and you really aren't fragmenting when it's really easy to move between them. And so that's maybe that argument summed up really concisely.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, and I agree with your kind of broader point about like the visions for these different chains, like either have everything on one layer or have it kind of on multiple layers. And I think that Ethereum not only is trying to go the path of the internet, but also just the path of how humans work, right? Like humans are modular by nature, modular beings. There's not one country in the world, right? There's not one culture. There's not one language. There's not one of anything really that we all kind of. There's not one religion, right? Like it's always modularized because people have different wants and needs and different belief systems and all that sorts of stuff. So to think that the humans are going to be like the Borg, which is what I view like these monolithic chains like Solana as, versus being humans, which are inherently, you know, we're very modular kind of people. We're very kind of fragmented people to begin with, where we create systems to bring us together. Like we create countries to bring all types of people together, right? And we have all different types of religions and races and all that in the different countries. But, you know, to say that we're all just going to be one kind of hive mind, I don't think is the right approach here. And maybe people will disagree with that analogy and say, oh, that's not how we're building monolithic chains. We don't think like that. And that's fine. But that's how I generally view it. I think that Ethereum is building for what humanity is and what humanity has demonstrated that it is for many, many, you know, thousands, tens of thousands of years here. And I think that's a major reason why it will win, because humans are just modular by nature. Humans are the ones building these things. They're the ones using these things. Yes, machines will use them too, bots and AI, but who codes the bots, right? Who controls the AIs? I mean, for now, but like that's the kind of whole point, I guess, is that we are modular by nature, and we're trying to create things that reflect that.
And there's a lot of people that will make fun of Ethereum and they'll say, hey, there's too many L2s. Like every other day, there's a new L2 launching. And I've heard people say, we're not going to have, you know, one chain. We're not going to have 10 chains. We're going to have millions of chains. And people like laugh at that. They're like, you think we're going to bridge between millions of chains? But when you use the internet analogy, it makes a lot of sense. Like if you think of it like the internet, there is like millions of websites. there's a lot of them. And it's not that there's like a million websites that are all AOL. It's not like, you know, every website ended up being like an AOL clone where like it does everything. They're all specialized. They all do very unique things. And that's why you have a lot of them, is because they're not general purpose, but they're very unique. And there's a lot of properties you could tap into if you had a bunch of unique blockchains that all seamlessly work together. Imagine like blockchain A and blockchain C can talk to each other, transact between each other. And so it's like you're on blockchain A, you want to do a swap, but you want it to be private. So it routes it through blockchain C. It's done privately and it goes back to blockchain A. There's a lot of weird things you could do with that kind of vision. And I think Ethereum has that vision. Originally it was Cosmos. Originally Cosmos had this vision. Cosmos kind of has gotten everything right. They did.
There's a lot of interesting ideas, I think they got the ideas right. They got the implementation wrong.
Yes, exactly. But a lot of credit's due to them. Like they really did nail it. But Cosmos, I think Avalanche has their like subnets, which are similar to some sort of interoperability. Ethereum, you know, this whole concept of like an internet of chains too. And then I even think Solana, their vision is like kind of narrowed to more they believe they're going to be a big chain that there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen on, but not everything's going to happen on it. It's just they think there's some unique use cases for having a lot of things on one chain versus like the maybe microsecond it might take to, with an ag layer or like shared sequencing. They might have some sort of advantage when it comes to some sort of maybe adversarial trading environment with high-speed trading or something like that.
Yeah, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I also think it just works better as an L2. Like, there's nothing stopping someone from building a layer 2 that looks exactly like Solana. In fact, we have a layer 2 called Eclipse that is launching soon that is using the underlying technology that Solana uses. But as I said, they're a layer 2. They're not, they're not a standalone kind of layer 1 chain. So I think, as I said, I don't disagree with that vision. I just think that it probably is better instantiated as a layer 2. But at the same time, there are certain things that layer 1s have benefits over layer 2s. Like, you get sovereignty. You don't get full sovereignty as a layer 2. Like, you are, to use the United States analogy, states do not have full sovereignty, right? Like, they are still under the US federal government umbrella. They can secede if they want. They can go off and have their own sovereignty, but now you're not part of the United States anymore. You're not protected by the United States anymore. You are your own country, essentially, at that point in time. And there's a lot of consequences that come with that. Just like a layer 2 could secede, right? Could leave Ethereum and become a layer 1, but now you are no longer in the Ethereum orbit. You're not an enemy, but like, you are literally outside of the Ethereum ecosystem now. So I think that, there's a very strong force keeping the layer 2s there. And the layer 1s, definitely act as just isolated kind of islands that aren't in that
Which
orbit.
is a great segue into our next point, which is that the UK of maybe different chains, which would be, let's talk about the core security of Ethereum, or things like Eigenlayer, and how that fits into the picture. So we talked about Ethereum, the layer 1. We talked about Ethereum L2s. And then there's this other concept when maybe you do need, you can't be an L2, you do need maybe some more sovereignty, but you want to still have that security that comes from Ethereum. You can do something called restaking and become something called an AVS. So can you talk about what is this like core security concept with restaking, Eigenlayer, etc.?
Yeah. So restaking is basically the concept of just like reusing Ethereum's economic security to secure something other than Ethereum, layer 1, and obviously the layer 2 is built on top. So the best analogy I can use here is something like NATO, right, in the real world, where essentially you have a bunch of countries that are part of NATO, and they're all sharing security there. Now, of course, everyone knows that without the US in NATO, NATO wouldn't be really worth anything, because it's really the US military might that makes NATO what it is. The rest of them are just like, hey, we want your protection, the US military, please. Like, you're a big military, we want you to protect us. And that's why people join NATO, essentially. I don't think they join NATO because of the other countries. It's really just the US. And I don't think that's controversial to say. I'm pretty sure that's pretty obvious to people who know how geopolitics works. But it's the same with restaking with Ethereum, where it's essentially people saying like, okay, well, we want to be part of Ethereum. We want Ethereum to secure us. We want Ethereum to protect us. How can that happen? Well, you can take the existing economic security, which is the staked ETH asset, and then you can restake it as part of Eigenlayer as one of these projects, but there are others. And then you can create a new service. They're called AVSs. Where essentially you can spin up anything you want, and then you are secured by that economic security. Now, it's not the full economic security. You won't get all the ETH staked won't be securing your own AVS, and also the Ethereum validators will not be securing your AVS. The Ethereum validator software only secures Ethereum, but the same people running the validators on Ethereum can also run the software for your new AVS or your new kind of product that you're making. And that way you have this, same, we call them node operators, the people who run the software. And then you have the economic security of ETH backing that up as well. So you don't have to go create your own token, somehow drive a lot of value to it in order for it to be valuable enough to secure you. You just shared that security with Ethereum there. And this opens up a huge, world of things, because essentially a lot of the time people have tried to decentralize what they've built, but it's been really hard to do that because they have to go and spin up their own, security. They have to go spin up their own node operator set. Whereas with Ethereum, with restaking, you basically get a marketplace of node operators that you can choose from and say, hey, I want these people securing my network or my new service. I want the ETH economic security on my service. And this way you, as I said, like I used to use the NATO analogy, you share in that security without having to do it yourself and or without having to kind of bootstrap it yourself, because it's very hard. Like imagine a country that comes along today, a new country, and says, I want to be as big as the US military. I want the equivalent of the US military protecting me. Do you know how long it would take that country to get to that point? It's basically impossible, because they would have to grow their economy to some ridiculous level. And then it would take, hundreds of years for them to catch up to the US. Or they could join NATO and be like, hey, I want to be part of NATO so the US protects me if I get attacked, basically. Now, of course, joining NATO is not that straightforward, but it is with restaking to an extent where it's not like you can basically go and say, okay, well, I've got this new service that's spun up. I'm going to get the full security of Ethereum. There is a marketplace where essentially if your service is deemed valuable enough, then the kind of restaked ETH can basically be, okay, I want to go, secure this because they're going to pay me, a portion of what they generate as part of their economy back into me, and I get an extra yield from that, basically. So that's basically what it is, and that's the best analogy I think I can use for that. But in terms of the services that can be spun up, just some concrete ones. So there are Oracle networks that can be built up on this. There are, you mentioned shared sequencing networks that can be built up. There's also data availability networks, which is actually one of the flagship products coming out of EigenLayer, which is called EigenDA, where essentially layer 2s can store their data on this layer and offer even cheaper fees to users in return for a little bit less kind of like security than full Ethereum would give you. So they still get, more security from being on EigenDA, but it's less than what you would get from Ethereum L1. And it's getting quite technical now, but just generally kind of some examples of products that can be built there.
I think a really important point is similar to the L2s. This allows blockchains, like say if you spin up another L1, to be profitable. By essentially renting security from Ethereum a lot quicker and a lot easier than they otherwise would, because essentially, like I think the Cosmos chains, there's a lot of Cosmos chains that maybe do 10% inflation or 17% inflation. So they're like, they have to pay out stakers 10 to 17% to maybe even higher of in new tokens that they're printing every year. Now they can go to EigenLayer and they can rent security from Ethereum. And instead of paying out 10 or 17 or 10 or even 5, maybe they could pay out like 2%. And so they're like, wow, they've massively reduced the amount of inflation they have. And it's a lot easier for them to become profitable. And now they have the security that's like, it's not Ethereum level security, but it's similar. It's like maybe it kind of rhymes. It's relatable. And they have a lot higher security. And it is secured by ETH. Like ETH can get slashed. It's not tied directly to their... I think of things like Terra Luna, right? Like Terra Luna was this huge thing, and they had in-kind tokens. So they had the UST token and the Luna token. And the UST token, this is really, really loose analogy, was in a way secured by the Luna token, in that like its value was derived from Luna having value. Now, the thing that apparently quite a few people missed was that if UST had problems, and it was on shaky ground, that also happens to affect the price of Luna. So like you're backing it with an asset that was related. So when UST was like, oh no, this is going to collapse, everyone got scared and sold Luna. So that collapsed. So the thing that was supposed to back it became worthless. That's a problem with blockchains too. If a blockchain gets shaky, the asset that's supposed to like secure it could also get shaky, and you can have this death spiral. Well, with something like EigenLayer, the asset that's backing this network is ETH. And so if your network gets shaky, it's not going to affect the price of ETH, not at all. So that it has all these security benefits that you don't normally get, and it allows people to rent out that security and build different blockchains. And I really like your NATO analogy. That's a really, really good analogy. Moving on from the maybe the layer 0 of Ethereum, let's talk about ETH the asset. I think a lot of people really don't understand ETH the asset. I think when they get it with Bitcoin. So if you look at the Bitcoin network versus the Bitcoin asset, I would say probably 80% of the hype behind Bitcoin is because of BTC the asset, Bitcoin the asset, not Bitcoin the network. I think most people say, yeah, the Bitcoin network's slow, it's expensive. Up until recently, really nobody used it. Like recently now there's like this whole thing with ordinals and all this stuff where people are actually using the network. But up until recently, nobody was actually really using the network. But even to this day, people don't actually use the network for like transactions. They don't use it to be like, hey, I'm going to go spend some Bitcoin or anything like that. It really comes from the asset and people saying, wow, there's only 21 million. And that scarcity like gets them excited. They're like, hey, look at this asset. It's gone up over time and it's so valuable and a lot of people own it. But people don't often look at ETH, the asset, the same. Instead, they look at the network and they say, well, we're gonna base the value of Ethereum based off like how well the network's performing. But ETH, the asset's insanely interesting and has some properties that I think make it, in my opinion, a better store of value than something like Bitcoin is. So maybe can you give an overview of what is ETH, the asset?
Yeah, I think going back to what you probably said at the start around kind of like these belief systems around money, or people being forced to transact in money because a government tells them that, hey, this is money. Like, especially, nation states with fiat currencies, you have to pay your taxes in fiat. And that's like the main reason people are forced to transact in fiat, because the government's basically blessed it and said, hey, you have to pay your taxes in this. So it's just easier to transact in that and for that to be a unit of account. But fiat is a terrible money. It is a terrible store of value. No one wants to store their value in fiat. That's why, as you mentioned, like there are tangible things that people value, like property and land and other assets like gold and things like that. And the same is true for ETH and for BTC and for really any asset in the world. If people believe in it and value it based on any kind of reasoning, it doesn't have to really even resonate with other people. Like a lot of people don't think that ETH is valuable and don't see the value in ETH, but a lot of people do see the value in ETH. But it's not forced upon you. There is no central person saying, or no central government saying, hey, you have to buy ETH, or you have to transact in ETH, or ETH has to be your money and you have to pay your taxes in ETH, or anything like that. The only thing you're forced, I guess, is on Ethereum, the network. You have to use ETH as an asset, but to pay gas fees, right? Or you could use ETH as an asset to do other things like stake and stuff, but really, like, you're not forced into that. That's an optional thing that you do. You can either do that on Ethereum, or you could go to another network, do it on that other network. There's no one kind of forcing you, and it's opt-in. And because of that, these networks or these assets, they all compete based on people's beliefs on if they're valuable or not, based on, utility of the network, based on its properties, like, if it's a store of value, or if it's a money. And as we've seen, that means that most of the value gets concentrated into the most valuable assets. So I know that sounds a little bit circular, but to extend on that, BTC and ETH account for over 70% of the total crypto market cap. Like, that's a whopping amount. And BTC alone accounts for around, I think, 55% of the total crypto market cap. And it's worth $1.4 trillion today. ETH's worth over $400 billion today. And that is all based on people valuing it, based on their own beliefs, based on the utility that each of them brings, based on it being a store of value or a money. It's not based on anyone forcing them to value these things. Now, when it comes to ETH specifically, the beautiful thing about ETH and why it's such a unique asset is that it has both things going for it. It has the utility. As you mentioned, Bitcoin, the network, doesn't really have much utility. Even recently with the ordinal stuff, it's very cumbersome. It's basically a dollar store version of what Ethereum can do. Like, I don't actually think it's that great, to be honest. Like, it's very watered down of what Ethereum can do. But on the most part, and for most of its history, Bitcoin is not a utility network. Bitcoin is a network that only exists to secure BTC, the asset. No one is buying BTC because of ordinals. Like, they're buying BTC because of a shared belief that BTC is a store of value, is a money, and is like a digital gold, for example, right? Whereas with ETH, people have many, many different reasons to buy ETH because you can do many, many different things with ETH. You can stake your ETH. You can use it to pay fees on the network to do other things. Like if you want to go buy an NFT with ETH, you have to, you use ETH to buy the NFT, but you also use ETH to pay gas fees, or you want to swap it for another token, things like that. You want to use it as collateral to borrow against it. You want to do restaking with it. Any number of things, right? That's the utility a factor of ETH there. But then on top of that, we burn a lot of the ETH fees. We burn about 80% of the ETH fees. So ETH as an asset basically has a stock buyback, essentially, where millions of dollars of ETH is burned every day, and that gets redistributed to all ETH holders. And then when you stake it, you get a yield, both a yield that's paid out by the network, which is very low as a kind of overall inflation, and also from usage of the network in terms of unburnt fees and MEV, we call it as well. But then on the other side of things, you have what makes Bitcoin valuable, the store of value properties and the money properties. Like, I personally hold a lot of my value in ETH. Like, I consider ETH to be a store of value. I use it as a money. I transact in it as a money. So that's what makes ETH very, very unique as an asset. It's got both. Whereas BTC doesn't have the utility aspect to it. As you said, no one's using BTC as money. It's too cumbersome. The Bitcoin Layer 1 network has 10-minute block times. That means you have to wait 10 minutes for your transaction on average to be confirmed. The Layer 2s on Bitcoin are not good. Like, Lightning Network has been around for a very long time. It is not great as a product. It's basically unusable as a product. So yeah, Ethereum just has the best of all worlds, essentially. ETH, the asset, has the best of all worlds, both the the belief system of a store of value money and also the utility that just all feeds up into it and backs it all up.
Yeah, and we mentioned earlier in the episode that Ethereum is one of the only profitable blockchains, and people don't realize this, but it shocks them. It's like, I mean, last I checked, it was like $5 billion in annual revenue. $5 billion in annual revenue comes from Ethereum, and that, like you mentioned, that goes towards burns. So like that means we actually burn the Ethereum token, where Bitcoin has 21 million hard cap, and people love that. They're like, wow, we can never go over 21 million. And then they look at ETH and they say, well, it technically has unlimited, there is no, it can go as high as it wants. And so people freak out about that. But in reality, what happens with Ethereum is it's not actually growing. It gets smaller every day. The supply of Ethereum shrinks. It's a deflationary asset that gets scarcer and scarcer. So it'd be like if Bitcoin at 21 million, and the next year it's at like 20 million, and the next year it's at 19 million. Not that fast, but you get the idea. Like every year it gets smaller and smaller, and that's how Ethereum operates. Is every year it actually gets smaller and smaller, and it's not like just programmed in. It's from actual revenues. So all that revenue buys the token.
Yeah, it's not arbitrary, right? It's real usage.
Yes, it's real usage. So we mentioned revenue. We mentioned that it's deflationary. We mentioned the burn. You also talked about the yield that comes from Ethereum, and there's actually quite a bit of yield that comes from Ethereum. So you have it's like 3.7% staking rate that's paid out from the network, but then you also have the ability to do things like restaking, yield farming, etc. with the yield. And then we didn't talk about, I don't think, or you kind of hinted at it, that like with ETH, you can also, it's like a building block for money, right? So there's a lot of stable coins that are built using ETH. There's a lot of financial products in crypto that are built using Ethereum, or using ETH, the asset. And so there is so much utility and so many things that are done with Ethereum that you don't have with Bitcoin. So maybe we'll go through it really quickly, just kind of to summarize it. I'll ask you a question and then you answer. So Bitcoin has a 21 million hard cap. Ethereum has
a deflationary currency, deflationary money supply.
Bitcoin has no revenue, right? Or does it have a burn? How does that work?
It has no burn, but it has fee revenue. But the fee revenue is a tiny portion of its total inflation. So I think it prints about $65 million worth of new BTC every day and takes in about $1.5 to $2 million of fees a day. So it is, and that's not burned. And that is revenue technically because it goes to the miners, but they're printing so much more than what they're taking in fees.
Got it. Okay, so it does have revenue, but it's a lot. Do you know how big the revenue is annually?
Annually, I have to check, but it is a tiny percentage of the total inflation that Bitcoin is currently printing.
Okay. Then moving on from that, Bitcoin has no yield, and then ETH has
3.5 to 4% on average yields, and that's real yield. Not all of it is a real yield. Some of it is coming from new ETH that's being issued, but a lot of it is also coming from real usage of the network. So any fees that are not burnt, and also MEV, or the maximal extractable value that people may have heard of before, that also gets paid out as yield.
And when you say ETH that's being issued, again, to clarify, so just Bitcoin does that too. So Bitcoin inflates by like 1% annually, 2%, something like that.
It's more than that. I don't know off the top of my head what it is, but it's more than that. And they have the halvening coming up soon as well, so it's gonna halve there. But essentially, right now, I think based on the last, let me have a look here. I think it's like 1.6% or something like that, 1.7% a year. And then, that'll halve in this month, actually, in a couple of weeks to like 0.9%. But ETH is negative 0.3%. So and that's because of the fact that while Ethereum does issue new ETH in, to pay out validators, we burn more ETH because of the fee revenue that Ethereum makes to offset that issuance. So essentially we issue, over the last 30 days, we issued 73,000 new ETH and we burned 104,000 new ETH, which means that we have a net deflationary supply of 30,000 ETH over the last 30 days.
So Bitcoin's inflationary up until that 21 million hard cap, and that's how it pays out miners. gold's inflationary. A lot of people don't know this, but gold's inflationary because we mine more gold out of the earth. So gold inflates, but ETH is deflationary. It becomes a scarcer and scarcer asset. So you have that. Bitcoin is used, as far as I know, just as a store of value. Literally, the only thing that people use it for is a store of value. You buy it, you hold it in the same way that you might hold gold, and then you do nothing with it. But ETH is used for
everything, like anything and everything you can think of as part of a financial system and beyond. ETH is used within that, swapping for different tokens, using it as money, buying NFTs, using it to pay fees, staking it, using it as collateral, restaking it. And store of value, of course, as well. But yeah, I mean, the vast majority of BTC is not used for anything. It's kind of funny because the digital gold analogy fits here, whereas essentially gold is not used. Like people say, gold derives its value from its use. And it's like, well, no, there's only like 10% of gold that is actually used in jewelry and things like that, in electronics. Whereas 90% of its value is all belief, is all store of value, is all money. So the same is true for BTC. Whereas with ETH, I think it's the opposite, like where, the usage of the utility is so high that we actually see that on chain, that so much ETH is just being put to work.
Yeah. And there is that property too. When you think of ETH as a money asset, or ETH the asset, look at the fact that all these L2s use ETH as their native gas. Like not every one of them, but the most of them are. So the more L2s that pop up, the more places you're going to also use ETH. And the more in those chains, it's going to be used in all these DeFi products as well. And then when you look at restaking, if that pumps the yield from maybe 3% for native yield to maybe over time, at first it might get really wild, but let's say over time it settles down to around 7%, 8%, or even 10%. That's a really great place to go stick your ETH, and that's going to attract more and more people to want to get ETH and stake it and go use it to get this yield. So it's ETH, the monetary asset, actually has all this use and all these properties that I don't think any other asset in crypto has. Maybe in some ways you could say like some stable coins are used, definitely stable coins are widely used as well. But as far as like the building blocks for like all of money, all of crypto, on-chain finance, ETH is the core asset. Bitcoin was originally, actually, I remember this back in the day in 2017, everything was paired with Bitcoin. Do you remember this? It was like everything was whatever / Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was the monetary asset of all of crypto. And over time that changed, and ETH took that place and continued innovating and growing, and that's where it is now. So maybe can you fit us all together? So we had the layer 0, so it's like eigenlayer. We had layer 1, L2, the L2s, and then we had ETH the asset. So could you give like a quick summary, just going back through that, maybe like a 60-second summary, putting it all together.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about a lot. Like we talked about basically most of the major things that's going on within Ethereum. But if I had to kind of put it all together in a 60-second kind of pitch here, we talked about how Ethereum, the network, has so much utility, right? It offers so much value. It has so much security. It is a property rights management system where essentially the biggest names in the world, BlackRock, are using the network and have a confidence that the network is not going to steal their funds or steal their assets. It's not going to mess with their assets. They have these guarantees that the Ethereum property rights management system allows them to have. And then ETH as an asset attracts so much value because of all that utility in the network for its use as fees, its staking, its collateral, all that put together. And then we expand the network effect of ETH the asset and expand the network effect of Ethereum the network by having these layer 2 networks build on top of it and basically stay within Ethereum's orbit. So Ethereum, like another analogy we could use, is like the sun, and the layer 2s are like planets that orbit it, and we all form a nice little solar system where it basically becomes home for us, essentially.
It's a great way to put it. And I don't even think you would say that we're not going to be the only solar system. There's going to be Ethereum, there's going to be Solana, there's going to be there's going to be other different blockchain ecosystems, and we're going to figure out one day how to get those to interoperate and work together seamlessly and be good. It's just this was meant to be an overview of what is Ethereum, what are L2s, what is ETH as an asset, how do all these things fit together, and why are so many people, so many incredibly smart people that have been around the space for a long time, so passionate about Ethereum and the Ethereum community, when you have a lot of people that claim Ethereum's stupid because it's got high fees, etc. And that's because most people don't understand. Like you now listening to this podcast should have a big understanding of like, wow, Ethereum's a lot more than I originally thought it was. It's not just this one L1 blockchain that's high fees, right? And now maybe you even understand why those fees are high on that L1 blockchain, and maybe you understand like that's a chain. I think that when I think of the L1, that's a chain for whales. That's a chain for people that have a lot of money. That's for the BlackRocks of the world. That's like this huge, big, think of it as like a big banking chain almost. Like I imagine the governments, the financial systems of the world, they're going to want to transact on Ethereum because you know what? A $50 fee when you're moving $100 million isn't that bad. That's like, you're pretty okay with that.
Yeah.
And then the L2s are going to have different uses and use cases when it comes to retail, maybe payments, different things like that. And that's where those things kind of go. So I hope this has been a good overview, a good picture. Is there anything at the end that you have maybe to add, Anthony?
No, I think we covered a lot. Hopefully people got a lot of value out of it and kind of have a better understanding of Ethereum. I'm in the same camp as you where it kind of gets frustrating sometimes seeing all of the bad takes on Ethereum. And I think a lot of it's just got to do with the fact that people aren't educated about what Ethereum is and what it's trying to be and how it's unique in its properties and how it's trying to do something very different to some of these other networks and trying to scale in what Ethereum believes to be the most sustainable and secure way to scale without giving up the properties of what makes it great. Because at the end of the day, the way I view it is that if you're trying to build a blockchain and you're not decentralized, there is literally no point to a blockchain. You're better off just being a centralized database because a blockchain comes with a lot of trade-offs from a cost perspective, from a security perspective. It's more expensive, stuff like that. And if you don't have what actually makes a blockchain special, which is decentralization, then yeah, there's no point building it there. So hopefully people understand that the Ethereum is trying to be that thing in the best way it can be.